It's just so great to be here. It's wonderful. The weather's so beautiful. I'm here with my husband and my sons. Actually, we're going to go for a hike afterwards. So thank you for inviting me and to be able to sort of balance family time with some time to share your MDI results with you. What I plan to do, I have a presentation kind of walking through some of the sort of things that underlie the MDI and some of the issues that might arise, but I also want to make sure that you know that this is a process of understanding your results and things. So it isn't going to be just in one day you're going to understand everything, but really this is more about an opportunity for inquiry, for question, for curiosity, and to have the opportunity to also ask me specifically on certain questions that you might have about it. But also I want to say this isn't the end of the conversation, that even though I'm here today, I'm able to answer some questions, but there might be more questions that arise, and we're always there to continue to work with you at HELP to help you understand the MDI stuff. So, and I'm just thinking, just because I might go over a little bit, so what can I, just working about the time, so it might be about a half an hour. Does that work? Sure. Okay, so I just want to make sure. We'll see how it's going. So I just want to start with HELP's vision at the Human Early Learning Partnership, which was founded by Dr. Clyde Hertzman. And then this is really important to recognize Clyde. He instigated, inspired, motivated, catalyzed all of this work. But HELP's mission at UBC, it's an interdisciplinary research institute, is thriving children in healthy societies. And the MDI is part of that. And some of you are familiar with the EDI, I'm guessing. So, you know, one of the things, in fact, to think about the EDI is that we now link the data from the EDI from kindergarten children to the MDI and in grade 4 and grade 7. And we are thinking, it's in the works, sort of, kind of, the YDI, which will be the Youth Development Instrument for grade 10. So we're able to really look at trajectories over time. So I'm going to do a bit of an introduction and background, sort of why now, what now we should be thinking about with this, and then I'll talk about understanding the MDI, a little bit of background on what the MDI is, and some basics that you probably, many of you already know, but I'll just go through them really quickly, and then talk about some of your results and some of those things. But I imagine most of you have seen your results already. Is that true? So, okay, great. But I also wanted to start, I always like to, so first of all, I'll share all these slides with you. You will have them all. So you can use them, or I don't know the best way. Maybe I can give you the USB right after to share them with you. But I just like to right away provide some really good websites of places I think that have really good resources for things as you're moving to action, including the Dalai Lama Center for Peace and Education. Is anyone going to the Heart Mind Conference on October 21st and 22nd? It's in Vancouver. Have any of you been to the Heart Mind conferences in the past? There's the one on October 21st and 22nd this year is called Cultivating Resiliency. And it should be really, again, and as you know, we videotape everything. So they have a Heart Mind Online of resources. There's Castle. Edutopia, is anyone familiar with Edutopia? Be a great one to share. If you've heard of George Lucas, no, Star Wars guy? It's a problem-based learning, and it has a whole focus on social-emotional learning, as well as this SEL school, a resource finder that's now at UBC and Greater Good Science Center. So as you move forward and think about your schools, I'm sure teachers would always be interested in knowing about some great places that have lesson plans and projects and things like that. So why now? I want to give a bit of a context of what children today are going through and kind of why we ask the kind of questions we ask on the MDI. And one thing about the MDI is it's really informed for what we know about what's important in this middle childhood and that period of development. And things like sleep and stress and bullying, empathy, as well as mental health are all these kinds of factors that are really important to examine. But I just also want to go back, you know, the MDI was really to look at children's life inside and outside of school, a whole child perspective. But even if you look at the schools and you look at the purpose of schooling, that even though we focus so much on the academics, that if you look at the sort of rationale behind starting public schools was to create socially skilled, contributing, and caring citizens in a democracy. So really, those are the factors that I think should be promoted. And I would say to the same degree that things like reading, writing, and arithmetic should be promoted in schools. And we know we put a lot of emphasis on the academics, And now, however, with the new curriculum, the curriculum redesign, we're now having a more balanced approach to this. We know that there are really increased stress among our children today. Have any of you recognized this idea of kids coming to school with more anxiety, more stress than previous generations? We're trying to understand what is this about. Some of it might be, things at home, things at school, the internet, but we know that stress interferes with learning. There's research now from neuroscience showing that children who have increased stress, it increases their cortisol, which is a hormone basically that we all have. It peaks about a half an hour after awakening and declines throughout the day, but there's good stress, which we all have at different times, and then there's chronic stress or toxic stress that interferes with learning that actually can do damage to the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for things like the executive function center, working memory, cognitive control, inhibition. And then in fact, children who have chronic stress can often look like they have attention deficit disorder, that even because of the stress and interfering with learning. And this is particularly toxic for kids that are younger and also who are in low socioeconomic status classrooms, but we know that there is a way to adults to be protective in that factor. We know there's increasing mental illness, particularly anxiety. Anxiety is our #1 disorder now and continues to increase in terms of clinical levels of anxiety, where kids are coming more often with anxiety. We won't talk about all the issues, but certainly there's the one good thing about anxiety is that it is something we know is really treatable, and there is evidence showing there's lots of interventions that can treat anxiety. This is something that's relatively new phenomenon called a stress contagion. So I've done some work with one of my former doctoral students, and I'll talk about that in a second, but we know, you know how like a common cold is contagious? Stress is contagious. That you can actually, if you're not stressed, but you're around a small group of people who are highly stressed, you will actually catch it and get the negative physiological effects of being stressed yourself. So this stress contagion can be realized in the classroom. The research we did is that we found that teachers who were highly stressed and had were burnt out, that the children in their classroom came to school, had higher levels of morning cortisol, indicating higher levels of stress physiology for themselves. So now we don't know which direction it is. It could be that the children are coming into classrooms highly stressed from home. The teachers who are empathic and caring are catching the children's stress because they're sort of picking it up from how all the kids are coming. It could also be that the teachers are now highly stressed themselves, burnt out, feeling just a sense of time urgency, and that they're coming into classrooms and the children are picking that up. And I would argue it's probably both. It's probably both of that idea. But again, this stress contagion is something really important. However, I will just give you a bit of a glimmer of hope here that like stress, happiness is also contagious. And you could redirect this to create a more happy classroom. And there's different ways to promote happiness. But again, it's an important finding from recent science. I'm guessing you're administrators for most part, that you're all sleep deprived. I'm guessing, sort of, kind of. Sleep is really important, just so you know. We know from the recent science that sleep is so important. It has, lack of sleep, poor sleep quantity or quality. So it isn't just the quantity of sleep, the quality of sleep really makes a difference. So children who are highly stressed don't get the same type of sleep that they would normally, and we know that sleep loss or deprivation is associated with things like obesity and diabetes, hypertension and cardiovascular disease, anxiety and depression, cognitive function, and again, sleep deprivation can look like attention deficit disorder. So again, you see these kids who are inattentive coming to school who just seem like they can't pay attention. It isn't necessarily their poor self-regulation skills. It could simply be they don't get enough sleep, or their stress is interfering with their sleep. Interestingly, I'll tell you, in Vancouver, a high school, Van Tech, heard about their MDI results for the grade 7s, and the kids were shared with the data, and the school had a wellness initiative. And the kids looked at their data and said, we're not getting enough sleep. We want to learn more about the sleep. So that last year, the entire school had their focus on wellness was on sleep. They had a pediatrician came in and did a whole talk about what happens to your brain on lack of sleep. They did I think the kids, they had a pillow fight, I believe. They had a sleep challenge where they challenged everyone for a week to go to bed at 10 and see what happens. They had a wake-a-thon. They had a sleepover at the school where the kids stayed awake all night, and at 5 a.m., CBC News came in and did cognitive tests so the kids could see what happens to how you perform on these cognitive tasks when you're sleep deprived. So it was a really interesting, and at one point there was a basket. They tried to get parents involved where kids came home with a basket and with directions, say, like at the end of, before dinner, everyone put their cell phones into the basket and don't return to them till tomorrow morning. So it's interesting, so again, thinking about these different ways you can move forward with that. And we know there is some research saying children today are less empathic than a generation ago. A study of college students from 1979 to 2009 used the same empathy measure of college students and found a significant decline in empathy. And just as you heard from Vianne, that I have studied empathy for a couple of decades. I think it's really important, empathy, just so you know. It's what we find, in fact, some identify it as one of the most important of personality traits because it really stops you from behaving aggressively, but it's what leads you to behave pro-socially or helping others. And I often argue that empathy and compassion and altruism are factors that are going to help us survive as a planet, because if you think about climate change, has anyone heard about climate change? Of those things, right? It's, a cousin of mine who works on climate change of the melting polar caps, that he said that it's empathy and compassion that's going to help us survive because we're going to have to learn how to get along and compromise with reduced resources. So anyways, it's again concerning what's happening with this absence, this decrease. The context in BC, you might not know this, but I will tell you because I travel around the world with doing all kinds of consultations and things, that BC is the leader in the world in the area of children's education and also social and emotional well-being. And we are the leader in the sense of we are the first jurisdiction that I know of in North America and beyond to explicitly, intentionally put the promotion of personal and social responsibility as part of the K-12 curriculum. I don't know of any other jurisdictions. I've been in Colombia. I was in Denmark, actually. That group in Denmark asked to meet with me. I was in The Hague meeting with a group, and they asked to find out what's happening in BC. The eyes are on us right now to see how this new curriculum or redesign unfolds. So just with these cross-curricular competencies. And now I'm just going to give you a bit of a context of the MDI. So the MDI really focuses on this idea of a paradigm shift that's happening all over as a way of shift away from ill-being to well-being. The focus on ill-being for decades was really because the whole area of psychology started after World War II, really in depth in terms of the research, and really had to deal with veterans returning from the war and looked at things like depression and anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorder. And it wasn't until about 15 years ago we started looking like, oh, we know a lot about why things go wrong. We know so little about things like happiness and joy and hope. Nothing really at all. So that's a whole new science called positive psychology or positive education. We know there's a movement away from intervention where you wait till a child has fallen into the water and you throw the life preserver out and pull them back up, that deficit approach, trying to fix them, to one in which is more about prevention, having the life jacket, equipping them with the tools that they have. If they fall into the water, they stay afloat. Or even better yet, giving the swimming lessons to them. So this is really, the MDI was formed based on this recent science of what we know helps children be successful. And also the movement around social and emotional learning, which I think even 5 years ago I could walk in and some people would know what it is. I can ask you right now, how many of you have heard the term social and emotional learning? I'm guessing all of you, right? So this is a growing movement, and CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic Social Emotional Learning, has identified these 5 dimensions of social and emotional learning as well. One thing I do want to say, it actually aligns very closely or actually exactly with the new personal and social competency dimensions, and I'll tell you a bit of that, and with the MDI. So this idea of having things that look at self-awareness and self-management. Self-management is another term for self-regulation. relationship skills and social awareness, and responsible decision making. These are all dimensions that are assessed on the MDI and also are all dimensions that are part of the personal and social competency. I'll tell you, it's not a mistake that or coincidence, it's cool coincidence that these all align. Because besides being the one who sort of helped catalyze the MDI, I also was the one who was the advisor for the personal and social competencies. So you'll see an alignment directly between the MDI, between the personal and social competencies, because I was the one behind both of them. And I wanted to make sure they aligned. And I think just to sort of emphasize this idea of social emotional learning and fitness. So how many of you know that physical fitness is important for health and long life and recovery from injury? Have you heard the science on that, about how important it is? There was a time we didn't know that, right? There was a time we didn't know the science of physical fitness. I'd say now we're at a point where we now know more about social and emotional fitness. So in the same way that you exercise, you make sure you walk and you're intentional in your activity, you should do the same things around social and emotional fitness. You know, starting your day thinking about, okay, how am I feeling? What are my emotions? How am I dealing with that relationship? In intentional, explicit ways to practice that. It's not something you can do once a month in an assembly. Like, you don't exercise just once a month and hope that it lasts a long time. It's something that has to happen daily as something that we all try and do. So it's just another framing to think about this idea of social and emotional fitness. And we know that kids who are socially emotionally fit have lots of long-term goals. Here's a recent study of kindergarten children and followed them until young adulthood. It was published last year in the American Journal of Public Health. And they looked at pro-sociality, both basically how much kids in kindergarten were identified by their teachers as helping others, cooperating. It's a very cool article. And what they found is that children with pro-social skills in kindergarten, so who cooperated, who helped, they were more likely to graduate from high school, complete a college degree, and obtain a full-time job. And those children with low pro-social skills were more likely to have spent time in juvenile detention, been arrested by early adulthood, have a higher rate of binge drinking, and be on a waiting list for public housing, just for how you got along with others and cooperated and helped in kindergarten. We also know a lot about self-regulation. This is very important, a longitudinal study. You probably all have heard this at some iteration. You know, we followed 1,000 children from birth to 32 years of age, and the single best predictor of your mental health, how you managed your finances, your relationship, all was based on self-control or self-regulation in middle childhood. The single best predictor. Another study actually found, again, this is in child, they looked at adult well-being, what predicted the sense of meaning, social engagement, and positive coping and pro-social values was in childhood. It was peer social inclusion and pro-social behavior. Interesting, this pro-social behavior keeps on coming up over and over again. In adolescence, it was things like quality of attachments, participation in activities, competence, and life satisfaction, which predicted how you were doing as an adult, your well-being as an adult. What's really groundbreaking, what we know from neuroscience, that these social and emotional skills are malleable. From neuroplasticity, we know you can teach these skills, you can promote them. So here's a little bit about the MDI. It's a self-report questionnaire, 4th and 7th grade, strongly linked to well-being, health, and school success, all those things I was just talking about, both inside and outside of school. It was developed based on scientific research on children's social and emotional learning and development and resiliency, and it was a collaborative process involving scientific experts, teachers, community members. I want to just tell you that, just as an aside, the MDI actually took 3 years to develop. Because what we did is we didn't just go into our ivory tower, and sort of say, these are the things that measures. We actually worked specifically with parents, with teachers, even school union members. We worked with community members, United Way, and then we worked with kids to figure out what were the dimensions we need to ask about in the MDI. So both the rigor of the science is there, but every step along the way was working in collaboration, and not in the way, I have to say, it takes so much more time. It's not in the way that you do where you just go and say, here's what we did, do you think it's okay? It was really sitting in rooms, rolling up our sleeves, and figuring out what kinds of questions to ask. And I will say, an aside, I have to tell you, the original MDI was like 150 questions. So, which you know, it's so long. And it was because it was so hard to get everything in. But I think it's still comprehensive. But if you say, why don't you ask this, and why don't you ask that? It was in there at some point, but we couldn't ask everything. Since 2009, 2010, the MDI has grown in terms of its participation across BC. Just as an aside, I want to mention that our hope in the short, well, it's not a hope. I think it's closer than a hope right now, is to have provincial funding for the MDI, so that the Ministry of Education, Ministry of Health, Ministry of Children and Family Development pay for the MDI. So we're working on it, chipping away, and we'll hopefully have good news soon. So why is it important? In terms of the things we ask, we know that across childhood, actually in BC, we have so much about early childhood with the EDI and knowing about children in kindergarten. There's actually another measure being developed about TDI, but we know so much about early childhood. And adolescence, too. We have surveys like McCreary Center Society that comes out and has surveys for us, and other kinds of surveys about adolescence. But up until now, with the MDI, there was not one universal population-based measure on middle childhood. Actually, no place that I know of in the world that asks the same kind of comprehensive about this area of middle childhood. And we know middle childhood, 4th and 7th grade, is a transitional point in development. It's that cusp. It's in terms of cognitions changing and understanding the world. Their social, their peer groups become more important at that age as they move beyond the family, academically and physically. And these are sort of transitional points. And we know it's really, grade 4 is where you could find out about how kids are doing, so you could intervene before they enter adolescence. And that's such an important aspect of this. It's a development of the whole child as a focus on children's voices. Just to emphasize UN rights of the Convention of the Child, that Article 12, that children have a right to be listened to and have their voices heard. Over and over again, I will say, I'll make a bit of a plea. When we first were developing the MDI, we went to the children and we said, you're our teachers. We need to learn from you of how to make a better world for kids. And they were so cute, like they're just so sweet. I don't know if anybody's been around grade 4s very much. They're just so, they sat up really straight up and they go, we're the teachers? And like, yes. And I said, okay. So they took it so seriously. It was just wonderful. So I just have to tell you. Here's a really interesting 5 decades of research on resiliency. Found there's one single best predictor. This is from the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard. Every child who ends up doing well has had at least one stable and committed relationship with a supportive adult. The single best predictor of well-being is a connection with a supportive adult. And I think Vianne, just even coming in here, talking about the artist here, talking about who that adult was. And this is my favorite quote. I use this slide in every presentation, just because it's by Yuri Bronfenbrenner, if people know him, that every child requires someone in his or her life who's absolutely crazy about them. So as you know, the MDI focuses on this idea of these relationships as central and multiple contexts. There's 5 dimensions: social, emotional, physical, connectedness, use of after-school time and school experiences. And I'm not going to go into details of all of this, but these were the 5 dimensions that we felt really were the most important for children at this level. There's various reporting, which you all know. And now I'm going to just talk about your results. I'm just checking the time. Okay. In about 5 minutes. Okay, am I good? One of the things I want to say, which is really important, just again to give you a bit of context for the MDI, that's different than the EDI. The EDI gives you an index of kids' of the vulnerability, right? And there's 2 ways we wanted to make the MDI a bit different. We wanted it to align with the EDI, so we were asking the same kinds of things about social emotional, but what was developmentally appropriate at that age. But we decided on 2 critical things. We decided to have a strengths-based focus instead of deficit-based focus that aligns with recent trends in science and research, and it actually is a different way, a lens in which to look at children's development in terms of this. And then we decided to have an assets focus, that we wanted to have not only how, we could have just had the social and emotional development thing and just said, here's how kids are doing, their worries, but we decided based on the 5 decades of research on resiliency, we now know what the differences are that make a difference. We know this, so the assets that we put in there are based on science, but they're actionable. These are things you can do something about. So school experiences, supportive adult relationships, after school time, nutrition and sleep are things that we know are malleable that you can change that surround the child. So I just wanted to emphasize, if you look at the difference between the EDI and MDI, this just gives you a snapshot of all the different participating districts. As you see from here, you had the largest percentage of children participating. This is just a snapshot again. Your participation rate was 71%. And I think if you look at the languages represented, this is probably, looks familiar. I'm hoping it's representative of the children. This goes and just tells you a couple of the things about the well-being index. We created an index of well-being based on different things like optimism and self-esteem. And also you will see this connection between the personal and social competencies and the MDI measures. Our plan for this next year and subsequent years is to have a one-pager that you automatically get your district and your school's profile on the MDI that aligns with the personal and social competencies. So, you know, one of the things about the new competencies isn't about just like measuring this one child. It's really about a sort of whole group approach, this universal approach to see how children are doing. So I'm hoping that eventually that the MDI data could be built into accountability. You know, look at the, like, you don't have accountability contracts anymore. What are they called? Something else for the schools? From the ministry? Required reporting for what you propose to do, right? What are they called? Okay. So anyways, this identifies this. So these are the 5 dimensions. So here's just some of the sort of highlights from your district. You see overall the results for your district that you have 47% thriving, a little slightly higher than the 46% thriving in the across the board kind of thing. So I'd say doing quite well. But still 29% of children are in this more vulnerable or low factor on this index of well-being. Just so you know, the way we do this is we have broken down the different constructs into high, medium, and low. And so children who are reporting really positive responses, medium who are reporting both positive and negative, and the kids in the low is children who are just reporting negative on these scales. So if you look at optimism, again, very high, 69% of children score in the high range on optimism. And optimism, just so you know, it's really important to be optimistic. People who are optimistic, who see the glass half full, who see potential, who wear rose-colored glasses, who are somewhat delusional, that's what some people would call them, actually live longer, have better health, have better recovery from illness by being optimistic. So optimism is a really important thing, and it looks like you're doing very well, as well as self-esteem. So this is, again, self-concept, like I feel, like a sense of empowerment. If you think about self-efficacy, like I feel like I could really be successful in what I put my mind to, that here, children here are doing high. And as you see, the lines means how the rest of the districts are doing, so slightly higher, with 87% having good self-esteem. Happiness as well, kids are pretty happy here. I wonder, actually, sorry, another aside is this whole research on the nature deficit. Have people heard this recent research on children today having a nature deficit, not getting outside as much, and how nature, being in nature, promotes well-being and health and all of that kind of stuff? And I just wonder, just given it's so beautiful here, if kids are outside more often, again, or if they're pulled inside with those electronic devices. And then you see empathy, again, higher empathy, and just very 3% with low. And I wonder how much your district is working on empathy. Roots of Empathy is here, I imagine. The Mind Up program that also focuses on empathy, and other kinds of just things like that, as well as pro-social behavior. And I want to go back to, remember my whole case about how important pro-social behavior is for predicting all these, whether you graduate from high school and earn a college degree and obtain full-time employment, you're doing really well in the pro-social behavior dimension. And then self-regulation as well, also very high in terms of at least the long-term self-regulation. Have you had a lot of emphasis on self-regulation in your district? And then absence of sadness. So here again, so sadness, and this is, so basically, because we try to do the opposite, the absence of sadness is basically the low score means that that's the percentage of kids who do have sadness or have scored on that. So you have 16%, which I have to say is very typical across the province, that you see across the province that children have higher levels of sadness, and especially the anxiety, like having the higher anxiety. 33% of kids reporting that they have these worries. It's not an anxiety. I have to sort of just distinguish between anxiety in the sense of an anxiety disorder versus just a lot of worries and things like that. And then you have, again, the comparisons between other districts. You'll see the sadness and worries very similar to other school districts as well in terms of how you stack up to those as well. General health, kids here seem pretty healthy, like they like their health. And then if you look at the assets now in terms of the adult relationships, peers, nutrition and sleep, and organized activities, we do find a relationship between the number of assets children have and their well-being. So that's all very related. Here you have very high with the adult relationships, peer relationships. Average in terms of nutrition and sleep, just so you know, over and over again comes as the lowest asset across the board. And I think most of you would agree with that. And it tends to be really around the sleep is the biggest issue that arises in terms of kids reporting the amount of sleep they get on a weekly basis. After school activities, a little bit lower. And it was interesting in terms of looking at the comparisons. You still have a lot of kids who are part of after school activities here, and some other comparisons with Langley as well. Adult relationships at school, you should be very proud. You're higher than most, that 77% of kids report having an adult at school who believes in them, who listens to them when they have something to say. There also is looking at, I do have to say, so we ask the kids, is there an adult at your school who's important to you? And we find tremendous variability across school. So it's very interesting how kids, and I could take questions about this if you have questions, but your district, so grade 4, 75% of them say I have 2 or more adults at the school who are important to me. And that's huge. That really is to say it isn't just one. Remember I talked about the one important one? We found that actually 2 is better in predicting their well-being than just 1. And it might be if that one adult leaves, they still have the backup adult at their school. But then if you look at a very close district, 27% of kids say there's no one. So you might first look and say 15% with no one, how could that be? That seems like so many kids. But it's very good, and so the idea is that, of course, you go and, I'll just tell you an aside, really interesting is one school that I worked with, they went right away to look at their deficit. They went and say, oh, we're low in after-school activities, we have to fix that. But they were really high in positive adult relationships. I said, I would actually start by spending your time with an appreciative approach. Find out, what are you doing to connect to kids at your school, to make it more explicit, more intentional. So they held a session, a half-day Pro-D, where they just worked with all the staff. So it wasn't just the teachers, it was all the people who had, because it's important adults, it's anybody who touches children's lives. It could be the custodian, it could be the lunch lady, it could be, the principal, right? And they brainstormed of all the things they did, and they found out they had really created a culture of caring unintentionally. And so what it meant for them is they really, by talking about it, they were able to think about what they were doing, but then to do it more intentional and explicitly. It was really a positive way to start rather than right away, let's figure out what we have to fix and figure out what can we do that really celebrate what we're doing well and do it more intentionally. And this is also in Langley, as you see, it's another district that has similar in size that has higher, so you should be very proud. And I just have to say one aside, what we find what's so critical when you go back to your teachers and you report these data is that you start with the successes. You start with an appreciative approach. What are we doing really well? Let's go for this. And here's a couple of things that are curiosities. I wouldn't say like we're doing bad in this area. I would say, this is really interesting why the kids are reporting being low on this. And to me, it's a point for inquiry. Let's go ask some of the kids. What do they think? What's happening? Even with the stresses or worries, if I had to advise you on some ways that I would suggest to go forward, I would really think of saying, let's find out what's stressing these kids out. Let's talk to them. There was a school district, Revelstoke, that they had high stress, high worries in their group of kids. And they started by doing sort of interviews to find out what are the stresses of kids in grade 4. And they even did something where they said some kids might not want to talk to us, so we put an iPad in the library so you could go and just push play and record yourself, so you don't have to talk to someone. And then you used it as a way to instigate, sort of figure out more of what are the things they could help kids with dealing with stress. So here's the adult relationships in the neighborhood. Very high here, I have to say, overall, as well as at home, with so many kids reporting really strong positive relationships at home, and peer belonging being very strong as well, and friendship intimacy, as well as eating breakfast, and meals with adults at home. This is very much 17%. It's kind of average, as well as the frequency of a good sleep. To me, this is daunting, the frequency of a good sleep. I really think we have to think about that more. The school experiences, I'm not going to go through all these in detail, just to say that you're doing on par or above the rest of the province in terms of things like academic self-concept and after-school activities as well. Really finding that the kids who are in organized activities quite as often as well. In terms of the educational, it looks like the sports are the #1, and this is very much aligned with other places in the district, as well as individual sports and team sports seem to be high. And then this just goes through the computer use, which is, again, you're right on par with where the rest of the province is in terms of the other districts, as well as the after-school activities. Now, what's so interesting here is that the MDI is the only measure I know in existence that actually asks kids not just what they do after school, but asks for their wishes. There's no other place that ever asks kids, what do you wish to be doing after school? And isn't it just fascinating that everyone plans after-school programming and they never actually ask the kids what they want to be doing? It's just fascinating to me. That it's just like, so of course, wouldn't you go to, if you're a marketing researcher, wouldn't you go to your consumers and ask, what do you want? And so what you find here, which over and over again is so interesting. So first of all, 82% of kids say, I'm doing what I want to be doing. But #1 activity that kids ask for every single time are physical activities and outdoor activities. That's what they want to be doing after school. So we're not creating this culture or this generation of couch potatoes who are sitting on their computers or on their internet devices. These kids want to be outside, but they often don't have the opportunity to get outside. There's things like parents, there's money, there's transportation. Did anyone ever notice the mismatch between when the school day ends and when the work day ends? Do you notice that? Do you know why does the school day end at 3 o'clock? Because of farming. That was, how long ago was that decided? Centuries ago? And we know now 80% of moms of children are in the workforce. So there's some mismatch. So these kids, I know, I've heard from parents say, I'd much rather send my child home where they're going to be safe. I don't want them going to an after-school activity. It gets dark so early, in the late fall and winter. I don't want them walking home by themselves at 5:30. And there's all kinds of barriers that we haven't yet overcome from a society level. And they often talk about the reasons they have to go home straight after school. It's the #1 reason of why they say what are the barriers, is they have to go home right after school. So just with the slides, I think you've looked at these just to sort of look at your community, which you know. Here's the well-being index with the darker green, meaning higher well-being compared to the other areas, but still quite high. This is adult relationships with darker colors. Just so you know, it's about the richness of the soil. The darker, the better the kids are thriving and growing. Maybe after the break, we can, if you have questions about this, I'm more interested, actually, not questions, I have questions about why is this variation in terms of these different areas, in terms of peer relationships or nutrition and sleep. I'm very curious of why those places have lower nutrition and sleep, as well as after-school activities of what's happening there. So I'm going to end there. I'm over time. I'm so sorry. You have to have a break, have coffee, and then we'll come back and you'll have time to work, and I'll be here to help make that happen.